In 1937, a world-famous pilot set out on a mission to do something that no one had ever done before. And with the whole world watching, she would take off into the air. But little did anyone know that would be the last time she would ever be seen. It was as if she had just completely vanished and no one ever knew what happened to her. Until now. But before I get into that story, if you're a fan of true crime, mysteries, and strange occurrences, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend. And now that you've done so, let's open the vault. This is the story of Amelia Earhart. On December 17th, 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright made 4 brief flights in a machine that they made that would come to revolutionize travel and society. This machine was, of course, the airplane. Of course, the plane that the Wright brothers made was a far shot away from what we have now in modern days. And air travel technology has come a long way, and there have been countless improvements, allowing airplanes to go from just short 2-passenger flights to making longer and more incredible journeys. But in the early days of air travel, these machines were really revolutionary technology. And because everything has a first, there was an incredible amount of records to be set by brave people who would dare to test the limits of this new technology in order to be the first to accomplish incredible and more dangerous goals. For example, in 1927, a pilot named Charles Lindbergh became the first pilot to ever take an airplane all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And this was an incredible achievement because never before in all of human history had a person been able to cross an ocean through the air and been able to cross an ocean in such a short amount of time. And this is where I must introduce you to Amelia Earhart. Amelia was a talented young pilot with a lot of ambition. She was one of those people who was always willing to test her limits and test the limits of her aircraft in order to do things that nobody had ever done before. And to go along with this very ambitious spirit, Amelia was also an incredibly talented pilot. So she was one of the few people in the world who even had the ability to do these long, dangerous missions that Amelia was into doing. To begin, in 1932, a few years after Charles Lindbergh had done so, Amelia became the second person to ever successfully fly all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and she would become the first woman to ever do so, period. And this flight across the Atlantic Ocean was such an incredible feat that Amelia would actually be rewarded with international fame because everyone was inspired by her courage and fearlessness, and it was very impressive the amazing thing that she had just done. And not only was Amelia becoming very well known and famous, but after this successful flight across the Atlantic Ocean, Amelia was awarded with a Distinguished Flying Cross by the US Congress to celebrate this brave achievement. So Amelia was becoming a very well-known celebrity of the time, and she fit into this role perfectly. She was always willing to talk to her admirers and to stop and take pictures, so she was just a very well-known and very well-liked person at the time. And as her fame and popularity continued to grow, Amelia would go on to set even more records and complete even more never-been-done-before flights. In 1935, Amelia became the first person ever to fly solo from Honolulu in Hawaii to Oakland City in California. And this incredible feat won Amelia a $10,000 reward, which would be about $200,000 in today's currency. And on top of that, it won her even more fame and popularity. And shortly after completing this amazing flight from Honolulu to California, Amelia would announce her most daring ambition yet. She was going to be the first person to ever successfully fly an airplane all the way around the world. And because Amelia at this point was such a well-known and well-beloved pilot, everyone got behind her and they were very supportive of her doing this mission to fly around the world. And even though her first attempt to do so would ultimately prove unsuccessful because of technical difficulties, this didn't stop Amelia, and she was very determined to do this flight. She kind of saw this as like her crowning achievement. Like if she could do this, then she would cement herself in history. And so in 1937, Amelia would try again to fly around the world. She went with her co-pilot, a man named Frederick Noonan, and together the two were determined to make it all the way around the world. And so Amelia took off into the sky with the whole world watching and awaiting her successful return. But this is where our story takes a sinister turn, because as you may have guessed, Amelia never returned from this flight. After that plane took off into the sky with everybody watching, that would be the last time anyone ever saw Amelia Earhart or Frederick Noonan. And we really don't even know a whole lot as to what happened to Amelia. What we do know is that on July 2nd, 1937, Amelia was flying near Howland Island in the South Pacific Ocean. And as Amelia was flying, the Coast Guard would receive a radio transmission from Amelia, but they couldn't make out the words very well. All they could really make out were the words, "We are lost, low on fuel." And as far as anyone knows, those were the last words Amelia ever spoke, because after that radio transmission, Amelia's radio went completely silent and she just vanished. And because Amelia was such a prominent public figure and so many people were watching and expecting her to be successful in this trip around the world, Amelia's disappearance launched a massive search to try to find out and try to figure out what had happened to her. And so eventually, after weeks of searching, both Amelia and Frederick would both be declared lost at sea and deceased. And Amelia's disappearance would make national headlines, and there was thousands of people wondering what possibly could have happened to Amelia, because she was one of the most experienced and considered one of the best pilots in the world. And then just to completely vanish without a trace just didn't make sense to people. And so a lot of people would come up with thoughts and theories about what possibly could have happened to Amelia, but none of these theories were ever confirmed, and so it would just become one of these strange unsolved mysteries. Fast forward 3 years, and a scientist was doing research on another island called Niku Island, and he would make a shocking discovery. On this uninhabited island, which was more than 350 miles away from Howland Island, the island that Amelia was supposed to be flying to, he found clear evidence that somebody had been there. Because as he was doing his research, he came across what clearly looked like the remains of a campfire. So as the scientist was kind of looking around this campsite, he comes across a human skull and a bunch of bones. Now, originally, these bones were concluded not to be Amelia Earhart's bones based on the technology that they had in 1940. But based on a further analysis of these bones and research done by a professor at the University of Tennessee, this is the clearest picture we have today of what really happened to Amelia. Back in 1937, when Amelia and Frederick took off on that runway, setting off on their flight around the world, they were both extremely excited. Both of them were confident that this was going to be the time that they were going to make it. They were going to make it all the way around the world. But one of the things that made this flight so dangerous and difficult was airplanes back in those days did not have nearly the navigational system that we have in aircrafts today. And because of this, doing something like crossing an ocean could be very difficult because it was easy to get blown off of course. So as Amelia was flying across the ocean towards Howland Island, which was her intended target, she ran into this deep fog which made it almost impossible to see anything. And as she's going through this fog, a strong wind picks up on the ocean and begins to blow them off of course. And so as they're flying through this fog, Amelia did her best not to panic, but she knew that they were in big trouble because they were flying basically completely blind through the fog, just hoping that they were going to make it to Howland Island. But she knew that if she somehow missed Howland Island, they were not going to have enough fuel to make it to their next stop. So if they missed the island, that they were going to crash into the ocean because they would just run out of fuel. And so this is when Amelia got on that radio and she made that distress call to the Coast Guard and said, "We are lost, low on fuel." But unfortunately, the Coast Guard wouldn't be able to get Amelia's location from this distress call, so they basically were pretty much helpless. But as Amelia begins to lose fuel, she starts going down in elevation just to try to see if she can see any kind of landmarks. And to her surprise, as she goes lower down in altitude, she sees way off in the distance Howland Island, the island that she's looking for. So she starts flying directly towards the island that she can see in the distance. But unfortunately, she just wouldn't have enough fuel to quite make it, and she would end up crash landing in the ocean just a little ways off of the shores of Howland Island. And as their plane crash landed in the water, Amelia and Frederick were both thrown out of the plane, and their plane was broken into pieces and would have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And unfortunately, her co-pilot Frederick Noonan would die on impact. But by some miracle, Amelia was not only alive, but she felt like she was okay. She was pretty banged up from the plane crash. She had a few cuts and bruises on her body, but she felt like she was able to swim to the island. She was only a little bit off of the shore. So with a great effort, she would begin to swim towards the shores of Howland Island. But of course, this wasn't Howland Island as she expected. This was a completely separate, completely uninhabited island more than 350 miles away from Howland Island called Nuku'alofa Island. So after finally getting to shore and dragging herself up onto the beach, Amelia was kind of confused that she didn't see anybody or any sign of civilization. But instead of wandering around and looking for people, she just thinks, okay, I'm wet, I'm wounded, I'm hurt, I just need to take it easy, set up a camp, and I'll be rescued soon. And so that's exactly what Amelia did. She had a few emergency supplies, and so she was able to start a fire and dry off some of her clothes. And then, because she was completely exhausted from this long day and this traumatic experience, Amelia would go to sleep. But little did Amelia know, Nuku'alofa Island had a terrifying secret. Not only is this island completely uninhabited by humans, it is very much inhabited, and some might say infested with, coconut crabs. Coconut crabs are a giant subspecies of crabs that can grow more than 3 feet long and weigh over 10 pounds. And these crabs are terrifying because they will eat and attack almost anything. The way that they get their name coconut crab is because their claws are so powerful that they can literally rip coconuts apart, and that's one of the main things that they eat. But coconuts aren't the only thing that they'll eat. Coconut crabs will eat anything from birds to wild boar, and sometimes they will be seen even eating each other. So as Amelia was laying peacefully on the ground on Nuku'alofa Island, hundreds of these crabs would have crawled out of their holes and out of their daytime hiding places, and they would immediately smell a strong sense of one thing: the blood from Amelia's wounds. And since they were attracted to this smell of blood, hundreds of these coconut crabs would have come out and gathered around Amelia Earhart as she slept. And so Amelia would have been woken up by the sharp pain of one of these 10-pound, 3-foot-long, alien-like coconut crabs clamping its strong claws down on one of her limbs. And she would have woken up immediately and tried to yank free, but the strength of one of these claws would have been far too much for her to escape. And even if she would have gotten away, she would have looked out and seen the sand and the beach covered in hundreds of these terrifying creatures, all kind of inching their way in on her. And so, unable to escape from these strong claws, Amelia was helpless as these coconut crabs just gathered around her and slowly began ripping her to pieces. And it wouldn't be until 3 years later when a scientist doing research on Nuku'alofa Island would come across a human skull as well as many bones from a skeleton that had been torn apart. And it was later confirmed in 2017 by Dr. Richard at the University of Tennessee that these bones were in fact the bones of Amelia Earhart. So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching this episode of StoryVault. That's it for today. I'll see you next time, but until then, be safe out there. Hey! Were you just about to click off of this video without subscribing? That's not cool. Be better. Seriously.